LSU wide receiver Malik Nabers would be the wide receiver one in most draft classes. Does that make him a value in your dynasty leagues? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Pro Football Focus and Behind the Steel Curtain. On today's show, we are discussing LSU wide receiver Malik Nabers, who a lot of people think is as good or maybe even better than Marvin Harrison Jr. Kate, what did you see in Nabers when you turned on the tape?
I mean, you saw as close to pro ready as you could possibly get. But Marcus, it's hard because you look at Marvin Harrison Jr. and you look at Malik Nabers, two very different receivers. But Malik Nabers, you have to love just as much, just for very different reasons. Now, wide receiver out of LSU, has 3 seasons to his name, had a absolutely monstrous 2023, 89 receptions, over 1,500 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns for LSU. And that's playing alongside a guy like Brian Thomas, which very incredible. He's 20 years old, kind of a little bit more undersized than a Marvin Harrison Jr., but still like a good size, 5'11", 6'8" inches, 200 pounds. Didn't get to see him work out, but I mean, you just can't argue with his production profile, his top end speed. He's led the SEC in receptions in back-to-back seasons, ranked second in the NCAA with 1,569 receiving yards. Over the past 2 years, ranks second in the NCAA with over 2,600 receiving yards. In that cohort, ranks 7 in missed forced tackles on receptions, 4th in explosive plays. Like Malik Nabers, a very, very solid wide receiver prospect who can separate and has the top end speed to be a threat at every single level of the field.
Yeah, I mean, he's an incredible wide receiver prospect. So, Kate, I went back and looked at the last 12 drafts and the first receiver that was drafted in those 12 drafts. And I'll read them to you. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Drake London, Jamar Chase, Henry Ruggs, Hollywood Brown, DJ Moore, Corey Davis, Corey Coleman, Amari Cooper, Sammy Watkins, Tavon Austin, Justin Blackmon. He is better than at least 10 of the 12 on that list. The only 2 that you can make an argument are better for him are Jamar Chase, who went 4 overall, and then Amari Cooper, who went 4 overall. He clears those other 10 by a significant amount. So I think, in 80% of the drafts, he's the clear-cut wide receiver one, no doubt about it. There's no competition. But because he's in a draft with Marvin Harrison Jr., he's going to be the wide receiver 2. And I'm not predicting this is going to happen, but there's also Rome Odunze, who is going to be a top 10 pick, who I wouldn't be surprised if other teams ranked Rome ahead of Malik Nabers, just because he's also a great wide receiver prospect. So it's really strange that we get this clump of wide receiver talent all in one year. While there's other years like last year where we don't have a receiver go inside the top 15, and it felt very warranted.
Marcus, if you are a dynasty manager with a top 6 rookie pick in a super flex draft, this is your year, because you can walk away with a top end prospect and you don't have to pick 1 overall or 2 overall. Like, you can have a high end prospect in the top 6, which just feels crazy. Tell me a little bit about your perception of Malik Nabers' greatest strengths as a wide receiver.
He is one of the best receivers that I've seen coming into the NFL at creating separation. Now we're going to talk about this as a weakness. I don't think he's the most polished route runner right now, but his athleticism and quickness and burst allows him to create separation with ease. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be this player in the NFL, but his movement skills remind me a lot of Antonio Brown. Like that's just he moves so differently than every other receiver in this class. He's also a vertical threat. That's why I like the Brown comparison as well. Makes plays down the field. You can put him in the slot. You can put him on the outside, and he can just run by defenders. But I think the biggest difference between him and Marvin Harrison Jr. is how good he is after the catch. He is one of these guys where you throw him a 5-yard slant and he could take it to the house. He is so hard to bring down after the catch because of the athleticism. He's so explosive. His lower body is so strong. I won't be a surprise at all if, as a rookie, Kate, teams are giving him 110 touches because he's just so good with the ball in his hands. Like, you've got to find a way to build your offense around Malik Nabers, because as soon as he gets drafted, he's going to be your most explosive offensive weapon.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. And something else I want to mention just in terms of I don't know, we can call it a strength, but I do want to highlight this too, is just his ability to play all three wide receiver positions. And we mentioned this with Marvin Harrison Jr. as well, but I think we really saw it with Malik Nabers, who got a lot more reps out of the slot, actually played 56.8% of his career snaps out of the slot, was primarily a slot receiver in his first season at LSU. We saw him split out wide much more often over the past 2 seasons, but even then, even just this past season, 53.6% of routes run out of the slot. I think he just gives you an element of diversity. And I think maybe the smaller stature to Marvin Harrison Jr. gives him a little bit more flexibility to be used out of the slot.
He's also a better athlete than Marvin Harrison Jr. is. Like he did not test at the NFL Combine. I'm not sure if he's going to test at the Pro Day, but the numbers that he would put up are bonkers.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
What do you have a projected 40-yard dash for him if he were to run it?
I do. 4.38.
Zoom.
I mean, he's incredible. He's so athletic. And it's just, there's some of these times when you just put on the tape. And one of the things I like to do, Kate, is like I like to watch a position group and watch all of the guys at one time. It just makes it really easy to cross compare. I was watching Malik Nabers last week, and the way that he moves is just so different than any receiver in this class. It actually reminded me a little bit of Garrett Wilson a few years ago coming out of Ohio State. Like, I'm a big Chris Olave fan, but the way that Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson move are completely different. It was so easy to see which one was the better athlete. It's just so evident on tape that Malik Nabers is a supreme athlete.
Yeah, for sure. Now, for all the strengths, of course, there are the shortcomings. What are the biggest concerns you have for Malik Nabers as a prospect? Obviously, they're not going to be plentiful. They're not going to have you hesitating in terms of, but we have to talk about it. What, if anything, has you just slowing the brakes a little bit on Malik Nabers?
Yeah, I think he doesn't have elite size or anything. 6 foot, 200 pounds. At least that's what his listed weight is. I don't believe he measured into the combine, which is
he
strange,
did not.
but yeah. So the projection is around 6 foot, around 200 pounds. It's fine. Nothing to worry about, but it's also not Calvin Johnson. It's not Marvin Harrison Jr. or anything like that. And it shows up a little bit on tape. There are some times where he can get into a contested catch situation and bigger cornerbacks can bully him a little bit. And I think that's going to be one of his issues early on in his career is maybe some of the more seasoned corners are going to be able to get under his skin a little bit. And you can see this too when he's as a route runner. Like I mentioned the separation, Kate, like phenomenal at creating separation, but it's also not the most polished. He's creating separation because of his athleticism, not because of the nuances of the route running. That'll come. I'm not super concerned about that. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes him a little bit to kind of get up to speed in the right offense. But overall, the weaknesses are pretty small. And I think outside of the size, everything can be fixed.
Yeah, and obviously, I think the physicality is probably the one that jumped out to me the most on paper because I like the way you phrased it. Right, there are cornerbacks that it sometimes feels like he's getting bullied by.
Yeah.
Marvin Harrison, conversely, it
He
feels
is
like
the
he's
bully.
bullying
Yeah.
cornerbacks. Like,
He is the bully.
and point one for Marvin Harrison Jr. in physicality, point one for Malik Nabers in terms of yards after the catch ability. Now, obviously, in terms of that separation, because it does come more on the back of that athleticism, that explosiveness, like going up against, true NFL cornerbacks, like might not pop off the same way in the NFL while he works on that route running. But I think all in all, just such a solid NFL prospect that we are just very spoiled to get him in the same class with a Marvin Harrison Jr. and a Roma Dunze.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about him from an analytic perspective because, as you would assume, the numbers are really, really good. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a number one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's number one sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That is $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even go pick who's going to win the entire tournament. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We want to let you know about Locked On Sports Today. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down that volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest sports stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's dive into the numbers with Malik Nabers. And as you would assume, somebody who led the SEC in catches the last 2 years comes out pretty well.
Yeah, you're not going to have much to complain about with Malik Nabers in terms of his advanced stat projections. Percentiles per PFF over the last 2 seasons, 96th percentile in PFF receiving grade, 79th in separation percentage, 92nd percentile in yards per route run, which we know that is a hashtag sticky stat. We love to see it. It can translate very well season to season and to the NFL. 80th percentile in contested catch percentage, which honestly, this is probably the one stat that just didn't feel like it matched necessarily sometimes what you saw on tape. We mentioned in our last segment, sometimes the physicality concerns, sometimes feeling like he's a little bit bullied by opposing cornerbacks when they're playing physically. Yards after the catch, 65th percentile. And what I want to bring up, because I think this is like a pushing point for me when we talk about the ability to get yards after the catch. He had a 76 percentile catchable target rate. I do think the ball placement of this LSU offense so much better than what we got out of OSU. Like it's so much better. Jaden Daniels could just optimize the location for where he's delivering a football to maximize yards after the catch. We talked about it as a huge plus for him in our prospect profile just last week. The same thing applies. The plus for him is a plus for Malik Nabers because I do think he put him in positions to really capitalize. And I mean, Marcus, because of his athleticism, if you put that ball in an advantageous position to maximize those yards after the catch, he's gone. Like one missed forced tackle and he's gone.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I just want to mention some other little stats that I had. Contested catch rate last year, 45.5%. That's right at league average, or at least prospect average. He had 10 contested catches last year, tied for 46 in the country. The drop rate was 5.3%, a little higher than you'd like, but also not terrible. Here's some stats that I really liked. 3.64 yards per route run. Like, that's some of the best numbers that you're ever going to see from a prospect at a Power 5 level who's been doing this for multiple years. Yards after the catch per reception, 6.6. It's okay. A lot of that is because of the way that he was used on offense. Again, when you look at him from an analytics standpoint, he just checks a lot of the boxes. There's no glaring red flags. There's nothing to be overly concerned about. He really does, again, check every single box that you want in a bona fide number one wide receiver.
It's very striking to see how spoiled this receiver class is, because we are getting a lot of high quality. And you know what, Marcus? Like, I think if you're in a rookie draft, you walk away with any of these 3 top receivers, you're going to be super happy. Because I mean, for Malik Nabers and Marvin Harrison Jr. especially, draft community, NFL executives, it seems like, are a bit higher on Malik Nabers, and in the buzz is kind of growing for potentially him maybe overtaking Marvin Harrison Jr.'s in the rank as wide receiver 1. I don't see that happening.
No.
And that's not going to be the case for my rankings, but
That doesn't mean it's not the case for some teams. And I understand why certain teams might be more drawn to Malik Nabers than other teams. So we're not dismissing that that's the case. Just for you and I, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. as the number 1 wide receiver.
And I think it depends too on what is your offense looking for. If you're looking for maybe more of the size strength mismatch that you get out of Marvin Harrison Jr., that might be the tiebreaker for you. If you're looking for the explosive and dynamic athlete, that's not to say Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't, but like, that might be the tiebreaker for you. Yes. And I do think that, like, these prospects, generally speaking, analytically on tape, both incredibly high end, high caliber NFL prospects, and ranking them, honestly, it really is kind of a matter of splitting hairs.
I could see teams that use more play action and maybe some tighter splits. Like, I think the Shanahan tree, like Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, Kevin O'Connell, like Kevin Stefanski. I think those type of coaches would actually probably prefer Nabers because he's a little bit better after the catch. He's a little bit more dynamic in kind of the short to intermediate parts of the field. He's better in the screen game. So I understand all of that. It makes total sense to me, but I like the receiver that can do some more of the vertical shots. That's why I have Marvin Harrison a little bit higher. A couple other things I wanted to mention before we move on. Last season, 30 missed tackles forced. That's 4th in the country among receivers. 19 deep catches, 2nd in the country among receivers. 624 deep yards. He can really do it all. Like, there's no part of his game where it's like, okay, he's only a short receiver. He's only a deep threat. Like, just so well-rounded.
Yeah. And you look at, again, the possibilities of playing all over the field. I mean, he really gives you no limitations as a prospect because of his athleticism, because of his particular skill set. You can use him in pretty much any situation that your heart desires, and he can work in with really any combination of receiver personnel. Like, there is not a lot of limitations with Malik Nabers in your lineup. And I think that that's probably also a big part of what is endearing him to these NFL front offices, and should also be endearing him to dynasty managers as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about his dynasty value and some player comps for Malik Nabers. This is going to be a lot of fun. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. On tomorrow's show, we're going to be looking at Washington wide receiver Rome Odunze, who, again, is another elite wide receiver prospect. So make sure you tune in for that. But Kate, let's talk about some player comps for Malik Nabers. Did you have any that stuck out to you?
I don't. And I want to hear yours because, again, this is a guy that can be used a little bit of everywhere, has elite top end athleticism. Who did you see when you watched Malik Nabers?
It's actually a former LSU receiver as well that played almost primarily in the slot for his college career. It's Justin Jefferson. The size is
Mhm.
almost identical. The athleticism is almost identical. How they win is very similar. Justin Jefferson, coming out of college, was an elite athlete who was still learning how to become a great route runner. I just see so much of their games that is similar. And I'm not saying that he's going to be Justin Jefferson, the dynasty in the fantasy player, but in terms of actual NFL impact and how they win, I think they are very, very similar. I've seen some people compare him to Jamar Chase, who was on that same team as Justin Jefferson. Chase played more on the outside and think he was a little bit more physical, was better at contested catch stuff, was a little bit more of a bully on the outside. I think Jefferson, I think that's his game. I think he's very smooth like Justin Jefferson is. And if he turns out anything similar to Justin Jefferson, it's quite the receiver.
I'm going to be honest, comps for this class have been a bit of a challenge because everything feels like
Yeah.
hubris and everything feels a little bit over the top for this class. But I 100% see it. And I do like the comp for Justin Jefferson a bit better than the comp for Jamar Chase. I think just in terms of physicality and more of the finesse factor. Like I that's what I like about Malik Nabers is that smoothness, that explosiveness, that athleticism, and less of that physicality, which he offers less
Yeah.
of.
All right, let's talk about his dynasty value right now in super flex leagues, or sorry, in regular startup leagues. He's being drafted as wide receiver 10. That is ahead of Chris Olave, ahead of Jalen Waddle, but still behind Tyreek Hill at wide receiver 9, Garrett Wilson at wide receiver 8, and Puka Nacua at wide receiver 7. How does that feel for you?
It feels low.
I
And
kind of agree.
And again, Marcus, I talked about this with Marvin Harrison Jr. I talked about how, generally speaking, I'm more of the, and I think you're a little bit more aggressive than I am. I mean, in your rankings, Brock Bowers, you've already proudly announced tight end 1 for
Yep.
you as a rookie. Like you have a lot less hesitancy in handing rookies the crowns early on.
Yep.
I'm always a little bit more tepid when it comes to that. But Malik Nabers at 10 does feel just a little bit low. And maybe you bump him up 1 or 2 spots. The guy that I'm really struggling with here, and I don't necessarily agree with this because, I'm going to say Marvin Harrison Jr. right now, my dynasty wide receiver 2, only behind Justin Jefferson. But I think Malik Nabers, like the guys that you need to be maybe considering in that similar range are guys like AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson. I do think he's ahead of Tyreek Hill. I think he's probably closer to the dynasty wide receiver 7 than the wide receiver 10.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you're watching with us on YouTube right now, you can see a graphic that Kate made of the top 10 dynasty receivers. To me, not even a question. I'm taking him over Tyreek Hill because of the age, because of what he can do after the catch. The draft capital is going to be insane. So that one's easy. Garrett Wilson's a little harder for me. I think Garrett Wilson is a superstar, already has 2,000-yard receiver seasons under his belt. I would still take Nabers. I would take him over AJ Brown as well. I wouldn't take him over Puka. I think Puka is just in a perfect situation with him, with the right coach in the right offense. But I think wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8 with a little bit of adjusting here makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that number feels a lot better for me. And I just think overall, and I think this is probably something that I've been more thoughtful of as years go by is that opportunity to have a wide receiver on a rookie contract. And obviously that's a big plus for NFL teams, but it's also a plus to have a guy with, once he lands in a situation, he's going to presumably be there for the next 4 to 5 years,
Absolutely.
and have a pretty secure situation. I think there's something to be said for that. That'll give him the edge over Tyreek Hill. And I do think maybe that contract window, that couple of years left you have before you really have to consider whether this guy gets an extension, whether he does end up moving on to a new team. Like you have just a couple more years, presumably in a stable situation with a guy like Nabers, as opposed to maybe a Garrett Wilson who an incredible prospect, has already produced at an elite level despite a lot of tumultuous steps in his career. But Garrett Wilson, we're going to have to look at, like, what does the future look like? Eventually they're going to move on from Aaron Rodgers, and do we want to be stuck in quarterback purgatory? Like, there's a bunch of little things that I think you can use as tiebreakers, is what I'm saying, between Malik Nabers and some of these other top tier guys. But Marcus, I think the main takeaway here is that Malik Nabers coming out because of the prospect and because of his opportunity, because of the skill set, already an elite dynasty asset for you to roster. And what's crazy, Marcus, you look at super flex leagues, and again, you might be able to draft an elite dynasty wide receiver with the 5th overall pick in your dynasty draft. How often does that happen?
Never. The last thing I wanted to mention on Malik Nabers is it very much feels like, as of right now, that Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to the Cardinals at 4. Whereas Malik Nabers, I think, goes inside the top 6 picks. I just don't know where. Right now, the Chargers hold the number 5 pick. That'd be ideal. Like, you pair him with Justin Herbert. Absolutely love that, right? I don't think we necessarily want him going to the Giants, although we've seen Odell Beckham, who is another very good comp for Malik Nabers, thrive there with subpar quarterback play. So maybe that's interesting. Don't be surprised if we get some teams jumping up to that 5th pick because the Chargers want to move down to try to get Malik Nabers. Like, for instance, I won't be shocked if the Jets come up from 10 to 5 to get Malik Nabers to pair with Garrett Wilson to really try to make a run. I won't be surprised if the Bears at number 9 try to come up and get Malik Nabers and pair him with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and give Caleb Williams just a bunch of weapons. I think Malik Nabers has a lot of potential landing spots here, despite almost being a consensus top 6 pick in the draft. Like, I don't see him going lower than 6, but there's a lot of teams that I could see him going to.
I do think that's interesting because it does feel like, we can probably, write Marvin Harrison Jr. in for the Cardinals. It seems like that's the most likely and most probable fit. It checks off a major need for their offense. But I mean, because of the range that Malik Nabers is going to be drafted, there's a lot of teams that could be potentially trading up and nabbing him. And, with the fact that the Chargers are reportedly looking to move back in a desperate way, which I think is a solid move. Like, Nabers could be open for business, and we don't even know where.
Yeah, absolutely. He's going to be one of the most fun prospects to follow during the NFL draft late in April. Can't wait to see where he lands. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow discussing Rome Odunze from Washington. See you then.